Two cadets stood beneath the photograph longer than their tour group did, and that was the first wrong note in the hallway. Why does the janitor's raised hand answer a question meant for a general, and why does no one in the room correct him? Marisol Devon tipped her head at the small brass plaque and asked the question she would ask 3 more times before the day was over. Who was Sergeant Dane? Spencer Pennington had the binder already open before she finished the sentence. The way a man opens a door he has walked through 1,000 times without looking at the handle. He was leading a knot of prospective parents and their sons down the engineering corridor at Cadwell Ridge, past the trophy cases and the framed citations, his voice pitched for the whole hallway to catch. "Old clerical thing," he said, tapping the glass over the photograph without quite touching it. "Somebody typed a name on a caption card in 1974, and nobody's gone back to fix it since. We digitize everything now, it won't happen again." A ripple of polite laughter went through the parents, the kind reserved for a competent young man being self-deprecating about a small thing. "So nobody knows who he actually is," Marisol said, not quite letting it go. "Nobody's had reason to chase it," Spencer said, already turning to walk on. "And photographs that old. Half the men in them didn't even stay for their pensions." That was when, from the far end of the corridor, a mop handle stopped its slow arc across the tile, and a gray sleeve rose into the air. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was the same unhurried motion a man might use to signal a question in a classroom he'd sat in 50 years before, elbow bent, palm open, patient as a held breath. The cart beside him carried a spray bottle, a folded rag, and a canvas roll cinched with a leather strap, and none of it moved when he lifted his arm. A few cadets near the back of the tour turned first, the way people turn toward a sound that doesn't belong, and one of the sons let out a short laugh before he understood there was nothing yet to laugh at. "That's Otis," a cadet murmured to his neighbor, not unkindly, just for information. "He's been here since God was a private." Spencer glanced down the hall, saw the mop, saw the gray uniform, and made the face of a man recalculating how much time he had left in his schedule. "We're fine, Otis," he said, with the particular brightness reserved for correcting an employee in front of an audience without seeming to correct him at all. "Go on and finish up in the East Wing. We'll let the cadets sort out their own trivia." Otis did not lower his hand right away. He held it exactly as high as he'd raised it, no higher, no lower, until it was clear the room had seen it and chosen not to look. Then he set it back on the mop handle, the shoulder beneath it stopping short of its full reach, the way it always did, and went back to the tile in front of him, as though the question had never touched him at all. Marisol looked from the plaque to the janitor, to the assistant director, and back again, and something in the arrangement did not sit right in her, though she could not yet have said what. If you've ever known the quietest person in the room was the one holding the whole record together, you already know where this is going. 47 years is a number nobody at Cadwell Ridge said out loud, because nobody had cause to add it up. Otis Hackney's rounds began before the mess hall lights came on and ended after the last cadet study lamp went dark, and in between he moved through the buildings the way water moves through a limestone hill, present everywhere, remarked on nowhere. He knew which stair tread on the north staircase had worked its screw loose 11 years running and would not hold a fix, so he simply avoided setting his weight on it and let the maintenance order sit unfiled, because filing it meant a contractor, and a contractor meant 3 weeks of scaffolding cadets would trip over. He knew which classroom radiator knocked twice before it caught, and which one didn't catch at all until February. He emptied trash without disturbing the papers on top of it, in case a cadet had set down a draft page not yet finished. His cart was a plain steel and rubber thing, chipped at both back corners, and low in the left side bin, beneath the rags and the extra bulbs, sat a canvas roll cinched by a leather strap with an engineer's stamp burned faint into the flap, worn nearly smooth by 49 years of a thumb finding the same spot to unbuckle it. Inside, wrapped twice more for good measure, was a slide rule he had ruled and re-inked himself in 1974, the bridging tables along its body cut into the boxwood by his own hand in a winter when the Army's issue stock had run short, and a man who wanted his numbers right had to make his own. He did not open the roll during working hours. He did not open it in front of anyone. But every third Tuesday, after the last light in the dormitory wing went out and before he clocked his own hours to the minute, he sat on the tailgate step behind the maintenance shed with the roll in his lap and did not touch the slide rule at all. That was for later. That was for teaching. And instead, opened a different object entirely, a cloth-bound ledger, softened at the spine, that had belonged to his wife. Lucille had kept it for 31 years before she passed, 11 years gone now from an illness that took its time and never got the satisfaction of an argument out of her. In the ledger she had written, in a hand steadier than his, the name of every cadet Otis had ever kept after hours to walk through a drainage calculation. Nobody official was going to walk them through twice. She hadn't asked him for the names. She'd simply started writing them down the year he came home too tired to talk about his day, and told her only that a boy named Whitlow had finally gotten the culvert math, and she'd said, well, someone ought to remember that he did, since he clearly wasn't going to remember it himself come morning. 31 names, across 4 decades, none of them aware they'd been written anywhere at all. On the third Tuesday of every month, Otis opened to wherever the ribbon sat, read the name under it once, and made a small check mark beside it in pencil. Not because the entry needed correcting, but because it was the only kind of conversation left to have with a woman who used to ask him, over supper, who he'd helped that week. Lucille kept the ledger of who he'd helped so he wouldn't have to remember it out loud. He closed it, buckled the tool roll beneath it back into the cart, and went home, to a house where the porch steps still had the give he'd never gotten around to fixing, because fixing it would have meant admitting there was no longer any reason to listen for her foot on it. By the time Spencer reached the archive office at the end of the corridor, the raised hand behind him had already become something he intended to forget by lunch. Otis means well, he told the trailing parents, in the voice of a man narrating a pleasant local eccentricity. But he's been here longer than the paint, and long service does funny things to a man's memory. Confuses him. We wouldn't want to confuse your boys either, with a story that isn't in the record. A father chuckled at that, the kind of chuckle that agrees with authority, reflexively, and the tour rounded the corner toward the model bridge display. Marisol didn't round the corner with them. She stayed a half step behind, closer to the plaque than protocol required for a work-study cadet on her way to her archive shift, and looked back down the hall to where Otis had returned to the tile, the mop moving in the same unhurried arc it always moved in, as if the last 90 seconds hadn't happened to him at all. He didn't say Sergeant Dane was wrong, she said, mostly to herself. He didn't say anything, said the cadet beside her, a second year named Reed, who'd fallen back with her out of curiosity more than conviction. That's kind of the point. Man's pushing 80, and he raised his hand like he was back in some classroom, probably thinks he served with the guy. Or he's confusing himself with him, said another cadet, Callie, not cruelly, just with the easy confidence of someone repeating what she'd absorbed from 3 years of hallway consensus. You know how the old guys get. Otis has been sweeping this building since before my dad enlisted. That's not memory, that's just habit talking. Reed laughed at that, quick and low, and it wasn't a cruel laugh either, only the kind that costs nothing to a person who has never had to defend a claim about their own life against a room that's already decided not to believe it. Otis heard it. He was 40 feet away, and the hallway carried sound the way old stone halls do, cleanly, without mercy, and he did not turn his head or slow the mop, only his jaw set, very slightly, the kind of small adjustment that would have meant nothing on a younger face, and meant, on his, that he had chosen, again, not to spend a word on it. Spencer reappeared in the archive doorway, binder still under his arm, a laminated card clipped inside its front cover listing dates in block print. Digitization certified complete. Shred schedule pending final sign OFF. He caught the tail end of the laughter and misread its target as harmless. Look, he said to Marisol, kindly enough, the tone of a man who believes he is being generous with his time. I get it. The photo's a nice mystery. Everybody loves an unsolved little thing. But I've got a state audit on this archive in 6 weeks, and every hour I spend chasing a caption that's 50 years old is an hour I'm not spending making sure the actual record is airtight. Sergeant Dane is what the card says. The card is what we have. If Otis wants to tell you different, that's between him and whatever he remembers being. He didn't say anything, Marisol said again, and this time it came out sharper than she meant it. He just raised his hand. Which is its own kind of answer, I suppose, Spencer said, already moving past her toward his office, the binder swinging once against his hip. But it's not one that's going in a state file. He said it lightly, the way a man says something he expects to be forgotten the moment it leaves his mouth, and he did not look back down the hall to see whether the man with the mop had heard that either. Otis had heard it. He finished the last third of the corridor in the same rhythm he'd used on the first 2/3. The bucket wheeled along at his hip, and if the words had landed anywhere in him, nothing on the surface showed it. No flush, no pause, no glance toward the archive door. He passed beneath the photograph once more, on his way to the utility closet, and for exactly as long as it takes to pass beneath a thing without stopping, his eyes found the crossing in the frame. The timber decking, the culvert mouths half-shadowed at the waterline, a young sergeant's face turned toward the camera, with the particular squint of a man who has just finished an all-night job and been handed no warning that anyone was there to record it. Then he went on to the closet and hung the mop and did not raise his hand again for the rest of the day. The archive room stayed lit an hour after the tour groups cleared out, and through its open door, propped that way for air, since the old climate unit labored past 5 o'clock. Otis's rounds carried him twice past a site most of the building never noticed. A gray plastic shredding bin wheeled in early and parked flush against the long table where the paper originals lay in their acid-free folders, waiting their turn at the flatbed scanner. He did not stop walking. He did not need to. His eyes took in the bin's position, the folders stacked beside it in an order that told him someone had already sorted the ones marked complete from the ones marked pending, and the laminated card clipped inside Spencer's open binder on the desk, its columns of dates ruled in a hand too neat to be anyone's, but a man who trusted the schedule more than the thing the schedule described. He passed the doorway a second time 40 minutes later, emptying a bin 2 rooms down, and noted, the way a man notes weather, that the folder for 1974 had migrated from the pending stack to the one beside the shredder. He said nothing to anyone about what he'd seen. He had said nothing to anyone about a great many things for a great many years, and it had never yet struck him as a debt coming due. Marisol's shift in the archive ran from 4 to 6, cataloging intake slips for the digitization log, a task dull enough that her mind kept drifting back down the corridor to the plaque. On her second hour, with the room otherwise empty and Spencer gone to a facilities meeting, she pulled the visible ledger, not the ceremonial roster kept for donors, but the working accession book that recorded when each photograph had entered the collection and from where. She found the 1974 crossing photograph listed under an intake date of March that year, sourced from the base engineering office, captioned in the same hand as the brass plaque, Sergeant Dane, River Crossing Repair, Spring Exercise. She sat with that a moment, and then did the thing her engineering coursework had trained into her without her quite noticing. She checked the photograph itself against the base's site survey map, framed 2 cases down, which marked every crossing point on Academy land, by number and by year of construction. The crossing in the photograph, the particular angle of the bank, the stand of sycamores just visible at the frame's edge, the 2 culvert mouths she could make out even in the faded print, did not match the survey's crossing number for that stretch of river in 1974. It matched a crossing that, according to the survey's own key, hadn't been rebuilt to that configuration until 3 years later. She checked it twice, because she distrusted herself before she distrusted the record, the way any good engineer is taught to. But the date held. The caption was wrong, or the map was wrong, or something between the two of them had been made wrong on purpose. And either way, no clerical mix-up of a typed name explained why a crossing 3 years too young was captioned as though it had already been standing. She thought of the raised hand in the hallway and did not yet know what to do with the thought, only that it had stopped being trivia. Spencer stood over her desk unannounced the following morning. The certified timeline binder opened flat against his forearm and did not bother with a greeting. "I heard you pulled the accession ledger yesterday," he said. "I'd rather you didn't go digging through intake dates on your own time, Marisol. It creates version control headaches I don't need 3 weeks out from an audit." "The caption doesn't match the survey map," she said, and set both books side by side on the desk between them, open to the relevant pages, because she had learned that showing a thing works better than arguing it. The crossing in the photo wasn't built until 77, but it's dated 74. Spencer looked at the pages for longer than his first glance suggested he wanted to. "Transcription error," he said, though something in his voice had gone half a register quieter than the hallway version of him. "Somebody misfiled a photo under the wrong accession year, decades ago. It happens more than you'd think with material this old." He closed the binder over his forearm, as if that settled the matter of where the conversation would go next, and it was in that half-second, with the ledger still open and Marisol not yet convinced, that Otis appeared in the doorway, with a fresh bag for the wastebasket, entirely on his ordinary rounds, and stopped when he saw what lay open on the desk. "That crossing," he said, the first full sentence anyone in that room had heard from him in longer than either of them could place, "was built in the spring of 74. I know because I built it." The room went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when a claim lands too plainly to laugh at and too strangely to believe outright. Spencer recovered first, the way men his age recover, with a smile meant to restore the room to a shape he understood. "Otis, with respect, the survey right there says otherwise. I appreciate you standing up for the old photo, I do, but this isn't the hallway. This is an accession record, and it needs to match a source, not a memory that's, 50 years old at this point?" 49, Otis said, "and it'll match. Pull the paper original stress calculation, not the survey card." Culvert mouths on that crossing were cut to 18 inches, set on a 4% grade, backfilled with river-run gravel, because the specified crushed stone hadn't shown up on the barge that month. Load rating we certified it to, by hand, was 11 tons axle, not the 14 your survey card claims for that stretch today. Different crossing, different year, same river bend. Somebody folded 2 records into one, a long time back, and it's stood folded ever since. Spencer laughed, but it came out thinner than the hallway laugh had, and he heard it thin as he made it. "Prove it or drop it," he said, and it was meant to close the door, not open one. The kind of line a man says when he expects silence to answer him, because silence is what this particular man had always answered him with before. Otis set the trash bag down against the doorframe, unhurried, and said the numbers again, this time slower, so a pen could keep pace. 18-inch mouths, 4% grade, river-run backfill, 11-ton axle rating, cured concrete apron, poured the second week of April, because the first pour cracked. In a late frost, nobody wrote into any log but his own. None of it existed in the digitized files Spencer had spent 3 years building his career on certifying complete. All of it existed nowhere he could check standing there. So he went and pulled the paper original. It took him 4 minutes to find the folder, migrated as it was to the stack beside the shredding bin, and another 2 to lay the brittle stress calculation sheet flat under the desk lamp. The pencil figures faded, but legible, a junior engineer's initials at the bottom that were not Otis's own, a supervising officer's sign-off, standard practice, the actual computation, clearly the work of the same hand that had, decades later, mopped this floor. 18 inches, 4%. River-run gravel, noted in the margin, in different ink, as though added after an argument. 11 tons. Every figure matched what Otis had said aloud, word for word, number for number. And every figure contradicted the load rating stamped on the Academy's official current blueprint, the one framed 2 cases down beside the survey map, the one cited in this year's engineering syllabus as a textbook example of a crossing built right the first time. Spencer stood over the 2 documents with the lamp throwing both of them into hard relief, and for the first time since the tour had rounded that corner, he did not have a schedule-shaped answer ready in his mouth. The 4 minutes it took Spencer to lay that stress calculation under the lamp turned out to matter more than he understood standing there, because the folder he'd pulled it from carried a red intake tag clipped to its corner, and the tag read, in his own initials from 6 weeks prior, "Certified digitized, original scheduled for destruction." When, Otis said, not a question so much as a request, for the one number that mattered now. Spencer checked the binder, and for once, the laminated card did not offer him the comfort it usually did. "Tonight," he said, "close of business. It's routed with 11 other boxes from the 70s. I signed the batch certification myself in October." He said it the way a man reports a fact he is only now hearing for the first time, though the signature at the bottom of the paperwork was unmistakably his. Marisol was already moving toward the record room 2 doors down, the one that held the full physical ledger of Academy engineering projects, the one that might carry a second, independent account of the 1974 crossing beyond a single stress sheet and an old man's memory. She badged the door, the way she'd badged it every work-study shift for a year, and the panel blinked red instead of green, then again, then locked out entirely. A small mechanical apology scrolling across its screen. Access suspended. Room scheduled for decommission. Visitor Center Phase 2. "That door's worked every day I've been here," she said, more to the panel than to either man behind her. "It's on the demolition list," Spencer said, distracted, still holding the stress sheet as though setting it down might change what it said. "The whole record room goes when they break ground on the new center. Facilities must have pushed the lockout early to keep anyone from—" He stopped there, because he heard what the end of that sentence would sound like out loud, and did not care to finish it in front of the 2 people watching him. It was Marisol's phone that rang next, not Spencer's, a mass calendar update from the commandant's office landing in both their inboxes within the same minute. The Academy's ceremonial visit from General Sawyer Grantham, chairman of the Board of Visitors, retired Brigadier General, previously scheduled for the day after the shred window closed, had been moved up. "Tomorrow morning, some scheduling conflict on the general's end," the notice said, nothing more specific than that, and no one in the archive room had the standing to ask him to move it back. Spencer did the arithmetic out loud, because saying it aloud was the only way he seemed able to believe it. "Shred order executes tonight. General's now arriving before I'd even have had my extra day to sort this out. That's—" He looked at Otis, and for the first time the look carried something other than the tolerant impatience of the hallway. "That's about half the runway I thought I had." "Then we don't spend it standing here," Otis said, and picked the trash bag back up off the floor where he'd set it, not because the room needed cleaning, but because his hands had wanted something to do while the rest of him worked out what came next. They worked the paper trail together for 3 hours that evening, Spencer at the desk and Otis beside him on a stool pulled from the supply closet, his bad shoulder held at its permanent half-mast as he turned page after brittle page, with 2 fingers flat against the corner. It was Otis who knew to look past the stress calculation itself, back to the procurement log stapled loosely behind it, because he remembered, the way a man remembers the weather on a day something went wrong, that the culvert stock delivered that April hadn't come from the base's usual supplier at all. "Rush order," he said, tapping the log with one knuckle. "Base supplier couldn't make the schedule. Somebody outside got the contract on short notice. I never asked who. Wasn't my place to ask, and there wasn't time to argue material once the river started rising." Spencer traced the vendor code through a cross-reference sheet yellowed at its folds, matched it against a supplier ledger 3 folders deeper in the box, and found the name typed plain at the top of a 1974 invoice. Pennington Contracting and Supply, single proprietor, Cadwell County. He read it twice. He did not read it a third time out loud, because his voice would not have carried it. "That's my father's company," he said, finally, to the desk more than to Otis. "He ran a supply outfit before I was born, before he sold it and went into county contracting proper. He stopped, because he had, in fact, heard his father mention exactly this contract, exactly once, at a dinner table 20 years ago, framed as a story about a young sergeant who'd saved the man's whole business by fixing a problem quietly instead of writing it up. Spencer had been 9 years old. He had not understood, until this exact minute, standing in a lit archive room at 9 at night, that the sergeant in that story and the janitor in this hallway were the same man, or that the problem his father had needed fixed quietly was a culvert delivered under a rushed contract with river-run gravel, standing in for stone, that never arrived. He undersupplied the stone, Otis said, not unkindly, laying the fact down the way he laid down a number, flat and without weight, added to it. I found it out the morning the barge should have come, and didn't. I made the call to patch it myself, rather than hold the exercise for a stone delivery that wasn't coming, because I had a convoy of boys due to cross that water in 6 hours, and no time to write a complaint that would have taken a week to answer. I never named the supplier in my report, didn't see what good it'd do the boys crossing that morning, and by the time it might have mattered to anyone else, your father had long since sold the company and moved on to bigger jobs. Spencer sat with the invoice in his hand and understood, in the space of that sentence, that his 3 years of pushing to digitize and then destroy every paper original in this room, his diligence, his audits, his laminated schedule he'd been so proud of, had been, without his ever choosing it, the last quiet motion in a cover-up his father started, and a janitor had spent 49 years absorbing the cost of in silence. I signed the shred order, he said, very low. I signed it to close out an old file I didn't know was hiding my own family's name in it. Then you'll want to be the one who stops it, Otis said, before it closes on its own. General Sawyer Grantham arrived at Cadwell Ridge a full 90 minutes ahead of the rescheduled ceremony, in civilian dress rather than uniform, and walked the engineering corridor alone before anyone from the commandant's office had finished setting up chairs. He stopped beneath the photograph the way a man stops at a grave he has visited before and knows the shape of without needing to read the marker. He was not looking at the plaque when Otis came around the corner with his cart. He was looking at the crossing itself, the culvert mouths, the sycamores at the frame's edge, and when he heard the cart's wheel catch on the same worn seam of tile it always caught on, he turned, and the 91-year-old face he might have half expected to find instead belonged to a man of 78 who had aged the ordinary amount in 49 years, which is to say entirely, and not at all in the ways that mattered. He did not say, "Sir," he did not say it's an honor, and the room, once it filled, Spencer arriving first, then Marisol, then a small clot of cadets and staff, drawn by word already moving faster than anyone had authorized, waited for him to say some version of it and watched him choose not to. Instead, General Grantham reached into his coat and drew out a small field notebook, its cover cracked along a fold worn soft by exactly one man's thumb over exactly one long habit, and set it on the corner of Otis's cart without a word, the way a man returns a thing he has been minding for someone else. He did not open it. He let it sit there and let the room look at it, and let 3 full beats of silence pass before he spoke at all. And the silence did more work in that hallway than any speech he might have given could have managed. I was 22 years old, he said finally, to the room, rather than to Otis, and I was in the second truck in that convoy, not the first, because Sergeant Hackney told the lieutenant running point to hold the lead vehicle back until he'd walked the deck himself one more time. He didn't explain why, he just said hold it, and the lieutenant held it, because you learned fast that this was not a man who asked twice for anything he actually needed. I found out 11 years later, at a reunion, what he'd found wrong with that crossing the night before we drove across it. He never told me himself. I had to hear it from another man, who'd heard it from a supply clerk who wasn't supposed to talk about it either. He looked at Otis then, directly, and something in his jaw did the same small work Otis's own jaw had done in the hallway the day before. An old discipline holding a face steady against a thing that wanted to move it. I have been chairman of this board for 6 years, Sergeant, and I did not know until 3 days ago that the man mopping this corridor was the reason I got old enough to be chairman of anything. He turned to the facilities director, hovering near the archive door with a clipboard she had not yet found occasion to use. The shred order for the 74 boxes is rescinded, effective now, on my authority as chair. I want that in writing before this ceremony starts, not after. Nobody in the hallway laughed at anything for the rest of the morning. When the room turned to Otis, expecting perhaps a citation read aloud, or a formal accounting of the convoy and the washout and the 11-ton rating that had saved it, he gave them instead the plainest thing he had, and the shortest. "I didn't do that patch alone, and I didn't teach that math alone either, not after," he said. "There's 31 names I could give you of cadets who sat with me after their evening study hours over the years, working the same drainage figures I used that night, none of them knowing why I was so particular about it. Whitlow, Devereaux, a girl named Tarrant, who went on to build bridges in 3 states. If anyone's owed a word today, it's them, for staying after when they didn't have to. Not me, for doing the job I was trained and paid to do." He did not look at the notebook on his cart while he said it. He looked at the crossing in the photograph instead, the way a man looks at a door he closed a long time ago and has no wish to reopen, only to know it is still standing. The re-engraved plaque went up on a gray Tuesday morning 6 weeks later, with no ceremony beyond a facilities crew and a level, and it read, in full, "Sergeant First Class Otis Hackney, U.S. Army, Combat Engineer, Bridging and Drainage Specialist, 1965 to 1975, Crossing Repair, Spring, 1974. Beneath his name, where a citation might once have gone, someone had chosen instead to engrave a single figure, 18 inches, 4% grade, 11 tons. The number he'd taught for free to any cadet willing to stay after hours. The number 31 names in a dead woman's ledger had once quietened into a pencil checkmark instead of a public word. The frame itself hung a foot lower than the old one had, low enough that a man pushing a mop past it did not need to lift his eyes to read it, and did not. Spencer walked the new cadets past it himself now, on every tour, and had stopped needing the binder to do it. He told the story plainly, without performing it, the way a man tells a thing he has finally earned the right to tell correctly. That a rushed contract once put bad stone under good boys, that a sergeant fixed it in one night, without asking credit, and that it had taken the academy 49 years, and one honest old man's raised hand to say so out loud. He never mentioned his father's company by name in the retelling, and nobody asked him to. The correction on record was enough, and the quieter one in himself was his own to keep. On the 3rd Tuesday of that month, after the last dormitory light went dark, Otis sat on the tailgate step behind the maintenance shed, with Lucille's ledger open in his lap, the ribbon fallen to a page near its end. He read the 31st name once, made his small pencil check beside it as he always had, and then, for the first time in 11 years, added a 30-second line beneath it in his own plain hand, dated that day, no explanation attached, because none was needed between the two people that ledger had ever really belonged to. He closed the book, buckled it away with the tool roll in the cart's low bin, and rolled the cart on toward the east wing, where a radiator 2 rooms down still knocked twice before it caught. Some names get engraved, some just keep sweeping underneath them. Tell us if you've ever worked next to someone like that and never knew it. The re-engraved corridor plaque, now correctly naming Sergeant First Class Otis Hackney, hung 1 foot lower than before, at the exact height of a man sweeping the floor beneath it, who does not look up.